opens next week on Thursday. 102 minutes MA. So if you're into thriller and horror, this is the genre that some people will run away from and others will run towards. We're talking North Denver. We are talking 1978. And there's a 13-year-old by the name of Finney, played by Mason Thames. He's a school kid who is a decent baseball pitcher. Looks like he's about to strike out a rather big hitter called Bruce, played by Tristan Prevong. But after a couple of strikes, Bruce goes all the way, home run. So clearly he's happy with himself and he rides his bike home. That's when a black van looms ominously. Suddenly Bruce is no longer with us. He's disappeared. And he's not the first to vanish. A police manhunt for him has come up empty. More snatchings will follow. So the cops call on Finney's straight-talking, foul-mouthed sister, Gwen. Now, Gwen, both of them are around about the same age. I couldn't quite gauge. I think she might have been a year or so younger, but much the same age. Gwen's played by Madeline McGraw. They hear, they being the cops, that Gwen has been having visions about black balloons that have been found at the scene. Truth is that Gwen, like her mother before her, unfortunately her mother took her own life, sees things. Truth is that there is something behind her dreams. That's why the police are called upon her. Problem is that her father, played by Jeremy Davies, uses corporal punishment to try to beat that idea of vision out of her. He does not want her to follow in her mother's footsteps. So the idea may be right, but his execution is anything but. He's a really heavy drinker, the father, and both Gwen and Finney are scared of their dad, who treats them shamefully, even though he does say that he loves them. Further, Finney's someone picked on at school, so he's bullied, and he'd rather be pummeled than stand up for himself. And then he is also captured by the man known as the Grabber, played by Ethan Hawke. This is the man in the black van, played by Ethan Hawke, locks Finney into a soundproof home basement, entry to which is through a heavy steel door. The Grabber wears one mask over his mouth and another with horns over his eyes. He says he won't harm Finney if Finney cooperates. And in the room where he's being held is a mattress and an old black phone on the wall. It was disconnected years ago, and yet that phone still rings continually. On the end, the voices of the Grabber's other victims. This is written and directed by Scott Derrickson, written with Robert Cargill, and it's based upon a short story by Joe Hill. Derrickson and Cargill, they collaborated on the horror mystery thriller Sinister in 2012, and more recently Doctor Strange in 2016. And as you can imagine, a dark pall hangs over everything about this film. One thing I've got to say, I found some of the physical violence, the beatings and the strapping, particularly disturbing. And so is the premise of child abductions and worse, Dave.
Yeah, this is a pretty dark film. Scott Derrickson, of course, left Doctor Strange 2 to make this film. When I interviewed him, he talked about the fact that he really wanted to make a movie about his own childhood in North Denver. And he said the more that he explored what he went through in North Denver, and he said at that time, serial killers was something on everybody's mind. He said you just had Bundy go through the area, they'd had other serial killers go through, he said, and serial killers was something that in the environment where he grew up were talked about a lot, to the point where his next door neighbor's mother was murdered. So he took the story from Joe Hill, who is actually Stephen King's son, and merged it into his own story of growing up in North Denver. And I loved this film. In fact, I don't know, loved's probably not the right term to use, but I thought this was an amazing film. Scott Derrickson has showed throughout his career that he's a pretty gifted horror filmmaker. But this film, I think, even surpasses what we expected, to the point where when he gave his screenplay to Ethan Hawke doesn't normally play bad guys in films, and told Derrickson, I'm not going to make this film. He read it and went, I need to make this film. So for me, I found this film, it fits into that same area as Seven or Saw or something like that, where it's horrifying to watch. It's an uncomfortable watch, but I found it a brilliant film.
I didn't have the same feeling as you, Dave. I've got to say, I thought it was okay, but I thought there were flat patches, and I mean, creepy music from Mark Coven gives the movie an appropriate edge. I thought that Madeline McGraw was just fabulous as the feisty sister. She brought real attitude. She brought sass to the characterization. Most compelling of actors. So big future based on what I've seen here. What did you think, Peter?
I thought it was a reasonably good film, but I had some worries about the motivation of the Ethan Hawke character and what the purpose of the abductions were, especially abducting boys. And I thought there was a very unpleasant subtext about what this might be all about. So for me, it had a bit of confusion laying around the storyline about...
Sorry, when you say confusion, what you've just said is pretty obvious. So what's confusing about that?
Well, the confusion is about what the real reason for the abductions are.
Well, that's the undercurrent. That there's an implication there, which we won't go into any further detail on. But
no,
does that make it illegitimate as a movie premise?
Well, I think to me it seems a bit more exploitative as a horror film than it does as a revelation of a drama. So I wasn't quite as impressed by the film because it had those sort of holes in it for me.
Mm-hmm. How would you respond to that, Dave?
Well, I know that's going to be explored in the next film, more where the grabber comes from, but I didn't have an issue with that in this film.
There is a sequel. There is a sequel, is there?
There's going to be a prequel, so yeah. But I didn't really have an issue with that with this film because the film is being told from Finney's point of view, really, and also his sister's point of view. So they don't really understand why this guy is doing what he's doing, as is normally the case with a lot of serial killers. You don't find out until afterwards why they've done what they've done. But I think there's a little bit of a key in there as well that I think Derrickson has put in there with the brutality of Finney and his sister's father as well. I think that's a little bit of an indication to perhaps what the grabber has been through in his life as well. And there's apparently a line in the short story where it talks about the fact that the grabber and Finney have a very similar upbringing as well. So there's that's probably not as alluded to as well as it could have been in the film, but I thought there was enough in there to suggest that perhaps, he has had a similar father figure in his life as well.
Well, we talked about Madeline McGraw and how excellent she is. Mason Thames, more reflective as the hero. He's quite the contrast to the sister. The relationship, though, between the pair is critical in building the audience connection. I wasn't as sold, though, on the performance of Jeremy Davies as the dad. I thought that role was somewhat forced or affected, Dave. That sort of bothered me a bit. I also thought that there was an amateurish feel to parts of the picture. I'll give you a couple of examples, representations of the police and the bullies amongst them. I mean, I understand you could argue it's appropriate given the events depicted happened in the 1970s and therefore are more reflective of that era. But it can also be seen as falling short of the mark required of a film in 2022.
Yeah, I disagree with that. I thought that, as we've seen in films like and shows such as Stranger Things, that is the way that the police worked back then. Like I said, Derrickson based this a lot on his own interactions with people, and he admitted that a lot of the people that you see outside of the grabber and Finney, who are the characters in the short story, are based on people that he knew and experienced at that time.
Peter, did that worry you, those two things I mentioned, of the performance of the dad, for example?
Yes, to some extent, certainly it did concern me. And the overall feeling of gloom and the fantasy elements that come into it, especially about the disconnected phone, etc. I just felt that there were elements in the film that were not particularly well put together.
I mean, look, I said flat patches. There were times when I was waiting for something more to happen, and what was happening wasn't all that absorbing. And that's, so in other words, I found myself being distracted, which is not a good sign. But there are a few genuine jump out of your seat moments. There certainly are those, and its undercurrent, as we've said right throughout this review of The Black Phone, is decidedly nasty. It opens on the 14th of July, so that's next Thursday. It is rated MA for very good reason, as it should be. Runs for 102 minutes. It's called The Black Phone. I'm going to give it a 6.5 out of 10. Peter?
Yeah, I can only give it 6 out of 10.
Mm-hmm. And Dave?
I'm going a lot higher. I think this film really captures Joe Hill's father's work in his early work. I'm actually going to give this a 10. I loved it.
Oh my golly. That's your first 10 this year?
Second, yep.
What was the second? What was the other film?
I can't actually remember what it was now, but yeah, I've given 2 this week. I also gave 1 to Sundown as well, so, yep.
Oh, really?
I love Sundown, yep.
Yeah, I thought Sundown was very strong. I agreed. But 10, my golly. Oh, okay. Well,